Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Gabriel Jaja, producer. Police reform, police training, foot pursuit policy, how to comply, and lack of parenthood. It's been a year since the death of George Floyd, and a lot has changed and a lot hasn't. Dr. Anthony Bradley from King's College presents effective solutions on how we can promote human flourishing in Black communities. You can find additional resources in the show notes of this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line on our website at acton.org/actonline. If you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen.
I'm joined today by Dr. Anthony Bradley. He's professor of religious studies and director of the Center for the Study of Human Flourishing at the King's College, theologian in residence at Redeemer Presbyterian Church, Lincoln Square, and serves as a research fellow at the Acton Institute. Dr. Bradley lectures at colleges, universities, business organizations, conferences, and churches throughout the U.S. and abroad. His writings on religious and cultural issues have been published in a variety of journals, including the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Washington Examiner, Al Jazeera, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Detroit News, Christianity Today, and World Magazine. His latest book, Why Black Lives Matter, was published in October 2020. Dr. Bradley recently hosted an Acton Lecture Series event for us on this book, which we will include a link to in the show notes. Anthony Bradley, welcome back to Acton Line.
Thank you so much for having me. Delighted to be here again.
So last time we talked to you on this podcast was an episode released on June 3rd of last year. And it was the most downloaded episode that we had of the podcast last year, which is something that we're proud of and is also somewhat tragic considering the subject matter that we were discussing, because it was in the wake of the death of George Floyd and the protests that grew out of that incident. We're short of a year later from the last time we talked to you about this. And I'm curious, now that we have, in that intervening time, we've had a trial and a verdict in the trial of Derek Chauvin, the police officer, now found guilty of murder in the death of George Floyd. We've had other police incidents, some quite recently that I think we'll get to in a little bit. But I'm curious your thoughts on that incident and what happened in the 11 months since the last time we talked. What do you think has developed? What has changed for the better, for the worse in that time?
Wow, that's a fantastic question. I really can't believe it's been almost a year since we had what I would say is a paradigm shifting, a conversation about race and policing in urban areas. I think, we've seen that the rule of law works, right? That when people violate the rule of law, when the rule of law is able to be applied in the way that it was intended, even police officers, right, are not above the law. And so when we allow the law to do its job, I think that in cases where the evidence is really clear, the law is going to execute verdicts, and that's been a great thing. I think what we're also seeing, and maybe this is in part some aspects of the media's undoing, is that we're getting a skewed perspective that on the one hand we have a sort of massive problem with policing and African Americans in particular. That is that there is this sort of massive problem of police killing black people, particularly black men. And I think that narrative is a bit exaggerated, and I think it's part because the media, local news only tells the stories, right, to get ratings and to get clicks, and so they highlight those stories, but it just obscures all of the other people who tragically die at the hands of police. And I think the sort of overreading that narrative has really got us thinking probably about the country. But then secondly, we're confronted with the challenges of policing, in particular, some of the ways that policing reform has has been facilitated because of this. And I think, we have to be honest to say that policing is a hard job. I have friends who were cops, and in those moments where it's really tense, it's, instincts and training kick in. I don't believe all cops are bad cops, but there's certainly space and room for improvement. And I would lastly say, I think there's also space and room for us thinking about whether or not we may be over-policing certain communities. And by that, I mean also using the police to do things that police aren't trained to do.
The protests that emerged in the wake of the death of George Floyd and that continued in various ways throughout the last 11 months or so, do you think that there has been anything fruitful that has come of that? You had, when we discussed this on the last episode you were on, that there was rioting also associated with those protests. If we're looking at them as being hopefully a vehicle for some kind of reform, do you think there has been any fruitful movement on reform as a result of those protests?
There have been some great opportunities to have discussions locally. I've been really impressed by the ways in which local counties and local cities have been taking a hard look at their own histories over the last year or so because of the protests. And there has been this increasing awareness that maybe in our town we had some history that we need to talk about, and maybe we need to act on that history. And that has been, I think, a really positive outcome, is that more and more local communities and local institutions are looking at their history and asking really good questions. Were we a participant in some of the problems? What are some of the ways in which we may contribute to things being better? Are there things that we need to address and discuss within our own neighborhood? And that's been the most encouraging thing to me. I think the idea that we have to sort of nationalize all of the problems and solutions is in some ways unhelpful. And the ways in which people have been owning and focusing in on their local histories has been really, really encouraging.
I'm curious if you can pack a little more of that as I look at the protest movement, what I see is a lot of, and I find this actually to be a commonality now with a lot of protest movements, even if you go back to the early days, post 9/11 and around the time of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. You would have protests of that, and set aside what people may think of the Iraq War. But you would protest against the war, and you would also see people out there protesting against nuclear energy and a whole bunch of different things all kind of shoved together under one big umbrella there that made it difficult, I think, for people to have a clear sense of what this is truly about. And I think we did see a lot of that in the wake of the death of George Floyd as well. Maybe a little bit more focused. I know we discussed on the last episode that you were on that you had anti-capitalist rhetoric being included within that too. But what we also saw over the course of the last year was the emergence of the idea of defunding the police being what a lot of people focused on as a proposed solution. Do you think that those complications or those various other ideas that got grouped together under one big umbrella were a hindrance to reform? And what did you think of the defund the police being kind of the big sticky ID that came out of that protest movement?
Yeah, those are great questions. One of the challenges that I think that we face in terms of identifying, what the problem is, that we want really simple analysis about what that is. And I think the reality is it's more complicated than that. And one of the tragedies, I think, of some of the protests and some of our conversations since the death of George Floyd is, and I've talked about this all the time, is the over-application of race as the variable that explains every single negative externality in the Black community. Right? Race, used to explain every single disparity between whites and blacks and Asians, race being used as a sort of central way to explain anything and everything that might be a problem. And so over realizing race, right, this sort of overuse of race as a way of explaining the why actually obscures some of the other variables that are really contributing to many black communities not thriving. And so we're not talking about some of those other things, right? We're not talking about marriage and family. We're not talking about job creation. We're not talking about some of those variables like entering into the marketplace. We're not talking about some of those other things. And so using race that way, I think, really does obscure the other issues that could bring great solutions. And when it gets reduced to a slogan, right, that's really tends to be more emotional than theoretical, right? Sort of defund the police seems like an emotion. It doesn't seem to be a rationally thought out platform. And what critics will say, they'll say, listen, well, when we said defund the police, what we really meant was redistribute the funding in the city so that it goes to healthcare and education. Well, if that's what that means, then you come up with a different slogan like, hey, let's redistribute some of the tax dollars to other programs. Defund the police, to me, seems to be really specific and narrowly just about the police department, right? Defund the police, in my mind, doesn't think, oh, defund the police, we should give more money to teachers. That's not a natural consequence of that. And what's interesting, and if you look at the data, is that every single major city that had these defund the police movements, crime went up, right? Because what sort of signal does it send to police departments? The community doesn't support you. We're not behind you. We're not on your side. And so policing, police officers, because they don't want to get attacked, they don't want to get sued, it introduced some incentives for them to step back in a lot of cities. And we've seen the consequences of some police withdrawal because they don't want to be they don't want to be attacked. And what's interesting also in the data is that the slogan defund the police was sort of often promulgated by people that live in communities that don't need the police. The people that live in communities that need the police, they weren't saying defund the police. They were saying more things like reform policing, make some changes in policing. But when you have these people who live in communities where the price point is so high that crime is low, it's a bit hypocritical for them to be talking about defund the police when they don't actually need those. They don't need policing in their communities. But that is something particularly, and there's been really interesting reports that have come after that largely, if you survey black communities, they weren't embracing that. That was sort of exported by the sort of progressive elites. That wasn't some slogan that came out of, sort of emerged in and out of the black communities that need policing. And so you have these progressives, right, sort of progressive elites who introduced the slogan. And because people didn't have a lot of other categories for reform, I think they unwisely settled on that one in ways that force people to redefine it in ways that, to me, just don't make any sense.
That's a very interesting point, that you'd see this in the media as well, that exactly what you said, that, someone would pop up, the slogan defund the police would come up in conversation, and someone would say, well, by defund the police, we don't really mean defund the police. But then inevitably there'd be another voice that would immediately pop up and say, no, we really do mean defund the police. And you can hardly fault people for being confused when they're told it doesn't mean what it says and it means what it says. The point that you just made about what communities are seeking, I'm talking to you right now from the city of Chicago, which plenty of people can read about in the news and know what's going on here. What I've always heard with regard to African-American communities in the city of Chicago is, the slogans such as defund the police are not popular, that it's not so much that they want less policing, that they want better and more accountable policing, that they think police are often around for smaller crimes, particularly those associated with revenue collection through fines and fees and smaller incidents. But everybody knows about the shootings and the murder problem in the city of Chicago, and they feel they're not present enough in preventing and solving those kinds of crimes. In your study of this, have you seen, is that a common experience in cities around the country, or might that be more unique to the city of Chicago?
No, not at all. I mean, I'm here in New York and do have a fair amount of work in Harlem. And you're exactly right. I mean, if you actually talk to people on the street who live in these very communities, they actually want policing to do what policing is sort of pledged to do. But what they don't want is over police presence, right? And it's sort of like a police state in these low income neighborhoods, where they often meddle in ways to create some revenue for their cities, right? And so, because their presence is there, it often escalates, and these minor incidences do sometimes spill over into things that are major. You have police, for example, in schools, they're handling domestic disputes and things like that. And we're not going to get at any really good solutions, I think, until we address the disparity from what the elites say these communities need and what these communities are actually asking for. They're asking for better policing, but they're also asking for jobs, right? They're also asking for better schools. They're also asking for the things that tend to keep particularly juveniles from having that first contact with police in the first place to be addressed as well. If there's no economic development in communities, if people aren't graduating high school, right? I mean, those are the sorts of things they're asking for help for. And I think, again, those are the sorts of things that get obscured by these really emotional slogans like defund the police.
You said a short while ago, you commented on how race has become so central in the way that we look at policing incidents. It is really, as I see it, become central in the way that we talk about almost everything these days. Why has it become the primary, or at least the first lens, or one of the first lenses through which we look at everything from crime and policing to education to business? I'm thinking particularly, as you said, you're in New York, what is going on right now in New York with the selective enrollment high schools, where the argument is really, as I read it, couched in very explicit racial terms. Why has this become our default mode for analysis?
That's a great question. I believe it partly just has to do with it being a trend line. If we were having this discussion, 20, 30 years ago, we'd be talking about poverty, right? I mean, poverty was a category that nonprofits and political leaders were sort of addressing poverty. And we're just sort of in this cycle where race is now, it's sort of like a whack-a-mole game, right? You sort of address poverty, like, oh, guess what? Race is now the thing. Race is a way that for a lot of people, it's just simply easy to apply that. It's the hammer, right? It's sort of race is the hammer that's going to hit all the nails. And in part, we're just lazy. I think, it's just not willing to look at all of the variables that make contributions to both human flourishing, but all of the variables that also make contributions to the negative externalities that we see in poverty issues, in preventing social and economic mobility, in violence, in the undermining of political and economic liberty. All of those things, right, there's sort of multiple variables, but we tend to focus on one because it's just simply easy, right? it's easier, and we don't have to think that deeply about all of the things that we have to do to actually bring about real solutions. Here's what it does. It makes the conversation nuanced and boring. And who wants that, right? Who wants a really nuanced, boring conversation where the solution's probably somewhere in the middle? And what it does, it just feeds the narratives of sort of tribal ideology. But it actually doesn't tell us what sort of solutions to bring. And so what it does, it seduces people into thinking, well, if we just solve the race problem, then everything will be fine. And in that sense, race becomes a bit of an idol, right? We believe that if we can kind of get this one big thing out of the way, everything else will fall into place. And we could just look at human history and know that's not going to happen. But in this current environment, race is being used as the hammer for all nails that keeps us from thinking really deeply. And it's really sad because, if you were to ask me, is racism a problem in America? Well, I mean, yeah, but so is gossip and slander and people being mean and stupid and ignorant. I mean, whenever you have a community of people, you're going to have people that struggle with their moral virtue and composition. And so, yes, there's lots of isms, right? But the question is racism something that prevents people from progress and thriving? And people want to argue that race is that thing, but we have to look at the data to see if that's actually true. But racist gives us a really convenient way of not doing our homework.
Why do you think it is so hard for people to accept something that you hinted at there, that we are fallen creatures, and that the idea of getting rid of racism as a problem is no more possible than abolishing our fallen nature? Why is that so hard for people to accept and want to believe in this idea, despite all evidence of this kind of perfectibility of man, that we can solve racism forever and there'll never be any kind of race-motivated hatred ever again? Yeah,
that's a great question. You mentioned the phrase "the perfectibility of man." I think ultimately this comes down to anthropology, right? What do you believe constitutes not just the nature of the human person, but what motivates humans? Right? What actually causes humans to move towards some particular ought? And if you believe that what really motivates sort of human nature to act as something that is related to their own self-interest and selfishness, then you're going to think about problems and solutions with respect to that. When you believe that the human person doesn't really have a nature, right? They're in some ways a clean slate, a tabula rasa of sorts, and it's the institutions in society that motivate human behavior. And so if we just tweak the institutions, right, if we tweak the external variable, then humans will naturally do what they are made or created or constituted to do, which is usually going to be the good thing, right? The best thing. And it's the institutions and structures, it's the things external to the human person that sort of motivate our action. And so if race then is one of those external variables, one of those external institutions, the belief is that if we just remove sort of race as something that sort of pollutes the well, and people will do the right thing. But that's an anthropological issue, right? And so, why is it that we have these different visions of both injustice and justice? Is ultimately because we have different visions of what constitutes and motivates the human person.
You mentioned earlier that people don't seem to want a boring and nuanced conversation. I think you're right about that. We started talking about the George Floyd incident, but I, in preparation for this conversation, had made a note about 3 recent police incidents. 2 of them happened here in Chicago, where I am right now, the shooting of Toledo and the shooting of Anthony Alvarez. And there's a third well-publicized incident in Columbus with Kia Bryant. The brief on those three incidents, Adam Toledo was being pursued on foot by a police officer. He had a gun that he had tossed, and in the process of turning around in a split second, the officer shot him. Anthony Alvarez was also fleeing on foot and was shot in the course of that pursuit. And Ma'Khia Bryant is a very different case where she has a knife and looks to be in the act of stabbing someone when the officer shoots her. And yet, as I observe the coverage of these incidents, they seem to me to be flattened. That the only thing that we need to know about these incidents is that a police officer shot and killed a member of a minority community. And there's no conversation or very little conversation about the differences in those cases and what we should take from them. And specifically with regard to the Adam Toledo incident, when I was asked about it, like, if they were to charge the police officer, what would they charge him with? And the honest answer is, I have no idea. And perhaps the only thing that could come out of that incident, as awful and tragic and horrible as it is some policy changes within the Chicago Police Department, maybe having to do with foot pursuit, maybe having to do with training, and that, you know, he dropped a gun, and you want to give somebody in that situation the ability to comply with police officer orders and not get shot. But we flatten everything out to talk about it as if they're all the same. Is that just part because we don't seem to be in a mood to tolerate nuanced conversation? Or is it just back to we just have one lens of looking at all of these things and just can't get out of that myopia?
You know, those stories are really, really sad and tragic. And when you watch the video footage, you know, you can see that police officers in half of a split of a second have to make a massive decision. And so you can see some of the challenges there, and you're exactly right. They get flattened because the narrative and the basis from which analysis is done is ideology, not evidence. It's not data, and this is why I opened with talking about the rule of law. If you value the rule of law, then you don't arrive at conclusions unless the law has made clear, right, based on the evidence and the data, what actually happened. Right? We have to allow the rule of law to in one sense do its job, or we lose the value of the rule of law. And I think in these cases, because we're so quick to have the ideological narrative confirmed that America is the most racist institution in the world, in all of world history, right? That's the sort of prevailing narrative. This country is only dark and racist and has made very little progress. What happens is whenever there is some sort of incident of an intra-racial nature, people say, oh, there you go, there's the evidence, right? Exhibit number 447B.12K, right? Because it's intended to feed the narrative. It's not intended to arrive at the truth. And that's, I think, what we've lost in this conversation is arriving at the truth, so that the truth can direct the reforms and so that the truth can actually help us arrive at what we need to do to make real progress. And it's complicated by, right? It's exacerbated, right? It's facilitated by, you know, social media, seeing only part of the clip, you know, rather than the whole incident. Right? We see 10 seconds. And it actually feeds the narrative. And so I wonder what would happen if instead we decided to have the evidence lead and to wait until all of the evidence is in and say, you know what, the goal is to arrive at the truth. The goal is not to feed the narrative, right? The goal is not to have my tribe be verified and affirmed as right. And we've lost, I think the interest in the pursuit of truth, and we see it in situations like these.
What you said there, the Adam Toledo incident specifically sticks out to me because even how deceptive what seems like the evidence can be is if you had watched news coverage here in Chicago or if you'd been on Twitter, you see the still frame of Adam Toledo turning around, seeming to have his hands up, which is a freeze frame of about a 1 second part of a video that is a much longer video, and it's all out of context. And you could look at that part where he has his hands up and say, this is completely outrageous, without even having the 1 second where he's turning around, and without having the entire video where you see what led up to it. I think that's an incredibly important point.
I was just going to say, on that particular story, because I've posted that freeze frame shot. I think for me, that shot of that kid with his hands, sort of approaching the sky, somewhat uneven, just really spoke to the tragedy of the entire situation, right? Just the sadness of this sort of conflation of lots of terrible things. You have a young teenager in the middle of the night with a weapon in his hand running from the police. Stop. What? I mean, we have to talk about that, right? Why is that happening, right? And then secondly, we just see the reality of what policing is like, right? You have to make a decision. And my guess is that this officer won't be charged with anything ultimately, because of the juxtaposition of the action that he took and the context of this kid having a weapon in his hand, right? And same thing in Columbus, Ohio. It's just sad that police have to be in the presence of children who have weapons in their hands, and police have to make really short, quick decisions. And what makes policing, I think, so heavy is that when we make a mistake at work, right? We have spell check might correct it, or there's a punctuation problem, or we have to go down the hall and fix it. For police, when they make a mistake, people get hurt, or in some cases, people may die, right? And I think what we saw in that Toledo case is that the convergence of all of those things that really made it really sad. Even if you took that frame and froze it and just sat and thought about the tragedy of it, you have to wait until all the evidence is in to sort of explain, is it unreasonable that this situation ended up tragically the way it did? And people asked me early on, like, what do you think? And I was like, I want to wait, right? I want to wait and see what that context is. I had a professor in seminary who used to always say, context is your friend, right? Context is your friend. And I think pursuing the context is something that we need to be even more committed to in situations like this.
I get the sense that if that officer is not charged, as I agree with you, I think it's unlikely that he will be, but that if we did get some kind of reforms to the way that the Chicago Police Department operates, having to do with what they do and when they engage in foot pursuits, possible modifications of the way that they're trained, so that as you would want, if an officer gives a command for someone fleeing to drop a weapon, they have a chance to comply with that. But then the officer's still not charged. I get the sense that all the focus would be on outrage over the officer not being charged and not as much on the reforms that had happened there. Do you think that's accurate?
I mean, that's likely going to happen because people aren't focused on letting the evidence and the data interpret context like that. And on the one hand, we want some resolution, right? It's just so tragic. We want to flatten it out and make it make sense, and we want to resolve all of the tensions that make us so uneasy about the pain that we experience when we see things like that. And again, we're just confronted with the reality of how messy these things can actually be. And you're right. We need to think about maybe we need to change the ways in which policing happens with foot pursuits. A lot of police departments have changed the way that they pursue, stolen vehicles, for example. A lot of police departments just let the person steal it and just wait because of the accidents that happen. And so it's not worth it. And so maybe they have to discuss what constitutes a reasonable and a legitimate pursuit. The challenge is, when the pursuit is with someone that has a weapon, that's different than the pursuit of someone who stole some candy or stole a cell phone. But if the person has a weapon, then that sort of changes the nature of the discussion. We may have to make some room for that. But I honestly think that police are the ones who should be having the discussions about reforming their own practice. I don't think it's my job as someone who's not an expert in policing to tell them, what they need to do. I think law enforcement as an institution, as a sphere, really has the expertise to know what's best in terms of two things, right? Protecting the public, but we also want these officers to go home at night or go home in the morning after their shift. I mean, these are men and women that have families and responsibilities, and they're connected and things like that. And so we have to, right? We want to somehow mediate between protecting the public, but also not putting officers at unnecessary risk.
Let's conclude here. You just discussed the importance of police departments and police officers and their knowledge and involvement in making reforms that would make their profession and what they do on a day in, day out basis better. For people who are observing the kinds of incidents that sparked our conversation last year and this year, the death of George Floyd, even incidents like Adam Toledo and Ma'Khia Bryant, and who want to advocate for some kind of reforms that will make life in these communities better. What sticks out to you as the most important reforms that they could and should be pushing for?
That's a fantastic question. So, the average person doesn't have, much power or influence over some of the ways that laws are written in their state legislature, which tend to determine police practice, right? Police enforce the laws at the state level. And on the one hand, I think people need to be more informed with the laws that are being passed in their state. So many of us are fairly ignorant with some of the things that happen at the state level. We're so over-focused on Washington, D.C., that we don't really think about the fact that most of the laws that we have, almost all of the laws that we have that impact us day to day, come to us from our state legislators. So pay attention to what's happening in the state. And if there are laws that are being proposed, if laws that are being offered really seem ridiculous, I think we have the sort of processes by which people can raise some objections with their representatives at the state level. Secondly, I would say, and even maybe more largely, while those structural reforms happen, we also need to be working really hard to put people in the sorts of positions where they're not going to likely have contact with police, period. And there are some things, right? We know the data is very clear. There are some things that tend to increase the likelihood that people will have contact with police. For example, in low-income communities, fatherlessness is correlated with juveniles having a high propensity of having contact with police. Not graduating high school, again, increases the likelihood of people having contact with police. Not having gainful employment, again, it increases the likelihood in low-income communities that people are going to have contact with the police. Drug and alcohol addiction. Those are the sorts of things that sort of increase the vulnerability, increase the likelihood that people in low-income communities are going to have contact with police. So I think if we really are serious about this as beyond the rhetoric, those are the issues that we have to work on. We need to put people in positions where they're not going to sort of have an increased likelihood of having contact with police. So if, for example, if you're working in a community and you're in a tutoring program and you're focusing on, some kid named John, and you're making sure John's grades are great, you're helping John graduate high school, you're helping John either go to college or get a job, you're making a major dent in police data, because those are the sorts of things that John needs in order to not have contact with police. So I would say, on the one hand, we need to work on these structural reforms, but we also need to put kids in position. We need to put children and juveniles, and especially because it's mostly men, in positions where they're not going to have contact with police, and working on marriage and fatherhood and education and jobs and things like that. Those are the sorts of issues that we don't realize actually undermine the need for police and will have a fantastic effect at reducing some of the sort of terrible situations that we've seen in recent months. If you have a 13-year-old kid who is in the middle of the night with a weapon in his hand, involved in gang activity, that's a different scenario than a 13-year-old kid who is in a home with a mom and a father who just had dinner together, discussing homework and making plans for the next day. That kid is not roaming the streets. That kid is not involved in gang activity. And that kid doesn't have a weapon in his hand running around at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Dr. Anthony Bradley is professor of religious studies and director of the Center for the Study of Human Flourishing at the King's College, theologian in residence at Redeemer Presbyterian Church, Lincoln Square, and serves as a research fellow at the Acton Institute. His most recent book, Why Black Lives Matter, was published in October 2020. Anthony Bradley, thank you so much for joining us today on Acton Line.
Thanks for having me again.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at actonline@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Gabriel Jaja.